most of the care companies are capturing more than half the value, and the caregiver is capturing less than half, and the caregiver is doing 99% of the work. So I think if you actually build a care company where the value captured reflects the value delivered, and you go for maximum scale, and you keep a very high focus on quality, I think you can build, a huge, like, why isn't there a $5 billion care company? Why isn't there a $10 billion? Why isn't there a $100 billion care company?
Ever wondered what happens when a hedge fund manager turns his personal caregiving journey into an AgeTech startup? In this episode of the AgeTech Podcast, I'm joined by Neal Shah, the founder and CEO of CareYaya, one of the fastest growing AgeTech startups in the world. Neal, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for joining me. So CareYaya is one of the fastest growing AgeTech startups today, and you have quite a unique value proposition to clients and also to the caregivers who come work at CareYaya. Can you share a little bit about the origin story and what even made you start this company?
Sure. I have a non-traditional career. Prior to starting CareYaya, I was a hedge fund manager. And in New York City, through my 20s, I became a partner at a multi-billion-dollar hedge fund. And, by my early 30s, I started my own fund that I grew from 10 million to 250 million by the time I was 35. During that time, unfortunately, I became a caregiver twice, one for my grandfather through dementia and kidney failure, cancer, and then end-of-life care. And then shortly thereafter for my wife, 3 years of cancer. And, it was like very difficult work, really opened my eyes to how broken the care industry is, and how underserved it is. The care agencies, I personally believe, are failing at their mission, to provide good care from good caregivers. And it creates a lot of burden and challenge on the family members. So, I ended up leaving my hedge fund career, which I'd worked my butt off for 15 years to build during my wife's care journey, just to be her full-time caregiver. And it really opened my eyes to, and then during my grandfather's care, my mom had done the same thing. She'd left her career to be my grandfather's full-time caregiver. And, I basically realized like how difficult it is, but also the opportunity in it. In our own care journey, we had used everything. We'd used care agencies. We'd found caregivers on our own. We'd used care.com. We tried everything possible both times. And actually the hidden secret that is known among a lot of caregivers and support groups is go to your local college and post flyers at the nursing school. There's a very robust informal care market in America. Something like 2/3 of the care market here operates in the gray market, around the formal care economy. People just find caregivers on their own. And within the gray market, students, and specifically healthcare students, is the best kept secret. So after, my whole journey and, after thankfully, knock on wood, multiple years of care, my wife finally had a recovery and has been in remission. At that point, I was just very obsessed with the care industry. And I was like, okay, so many people are having these problems. I can do something to solve it and help a bunch of people. And that was the founding journey of starting CareYaya.
Fascinating. It truly is. So it has to be one of the best kept secrets in America that you can just walk up to your local college and post a note saying that you're looking for a caregiver and hire a nursing student to do that.
Yes.
How does that translate from, okay, I have this secret? How do you build a startup on it? How do you then hire and train and retain? I don't know how many thousands or tens of thousands.
45,000 now. Yeah. Yeah. So to give you a summary, after 3 years of running it, CareYaya is national. We are operating probably one of the largest care workforces in the country. We have 45,000 students on platform, and we're in over 15 different cities at most of the top, 30 universities in America, and expanding rapidly. I think how do you start is kind of like, one step at a time, basically. We're located in Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina. So here we started in our backyard. We happen to be fortunate where we have 3 major universities within 15 minutes. So Duke University, UNC Chapel Hill, and North Carolina State University. So we started in those areas. Basically, the challenge that I found, from caregivers who want to tap into this amazing gray market is it's a lot of manual work. You have to go find students yourself. You have to put flyers. You have to go talk to the nursing professors. You have to text message and run background checks on all of them and interview them and then schedule them because, note, they're full-time students, so they can't do caregiving 7 days a week. So there's a lot of manual labor that goes into it. And I would draw the analogy to similarly when Airbnb started, the idea of like staying in somebody's place in an extra room. It was an idea, but it was a lot of manual work for the user to actually do that. So as Airbnb kind of brought that into the formal economy by making it so much easier for you to do, by adding all the pictures, by adding all the online scheduling, by adding all the logistics, suddenly it became a massive opportunity, and they actually expanded the market of travel stays. And, I think that this is the opportunity here, that a great informal market exists for people who are fed up with a formal market, which I personally believe is not doing its job. Most of these care agencies are doing a terrible job. No offense to anyone, they're run by nice people, but the business model is they charge you $40 an hour and they pay the caregiver less than half. And then the care quality sucks. Majority of the caregivers are minimally educated. Oftentimes they're doing second shifts, third shifts at the grocery store to make ends meet. And they're going to be super tired and exhausted and, not bringing their best self when they're caring for your loved one. And you as the booker, you're the customer, the healthy family member, you're going to feel guilty. So I think the care industry is totally, totally broken. And, as a result of that, you have all these people turning to the gray market and doing it on their own. But I think similar to Airbnb, you need to make it easier for them. So, we started with fully online, do it for me type of booking where you can put in the days and times and you'll get people. We did all of them, it feels seamless on the user's end. It was extremely manual on our end of running background checks on everyone, running interviews on everyone, managing booking and scheduling oftentimes manually. But we started initially with a pilot in our area at the 3 universities of a couple hundred students each. And, that went really successfully for the first 6 to 12 months, learned a lot from it. And then gradually, just through word of mouth, it started expanding across where we're located in the Southeast US. And then within the last year, it started expanding all over the country. So it's pretty cool.
Wow. And so what are currently the alternatives? What do nursing students who don't work for CareYaya, what do they currently do to bring in some cash to pay for school?
Yeah. Great question. And sometimes I feel like, innovations are empowered by other innovations. So in our case, a very robust gig economy and doing flexible part-time stuff around your schedule already exists. Unfortunately, it exists not in the care industry. So most of the students are doing, when we started at the initial universities, they were doing DoorDash or they were doing Uber, believe it or not, so we were like, okay, there's already people robustly doing kind of gig economy, flexible hours work around their schedules. But it's not meeting their need of they want to care for people. That's why they're going to healthcare careers. So how can we create and provide something for them? So, but yeah, before, and most of the places we expand, they're either doing, Uber, DoorDash. They're sometimes doing campus jobs, like working at the local coffee shop, working at the local, campus bookstore or whatever. So they're doing other kind of part-time flexible work. And, when you can get them informed that, hey, this exists, they're like, oh, okay, this is interesting. It's more in line with my long-term career. So why don't I do that?
Absolutely. And, as I was preparing for this conversation, one of the things that occurred to me is that one of the side effects that CareYaya has is that you could actually be improving the healthcare system overall because, these students, they don't just have a narrow view of what it means to care for someone if you're at a hospital or a clinic. They actually know what it's like when the person is discharged to their home and what the challenges are. So it might inform their decisions when they're caring for patients in a hospital or discharging them to their home.
Thank you for bringing that up. Oh, now that we've grown so fast and we've had tons of students successfully go on to graduate programs, the head of admissions at Johns Hopkins Medical School, which is one of the most prestigious schools here in the US, I was meeting with them because they gave us a grant. And on the side, he said, hey, I've interviewed some CareYaya students recently, and I've admitted all of them into medical school. And the takeaway was, he was like, thank you for doing the work because you're building so much empathy in these students, better preparing them to be doctors. And, I think that's really telling. And, I'm glad you picked up on the nuance because, it's kind of like an unintended side effect. We're just trying to solve caregiving. But in reality, the students are learning a tremendous amount of empathy. They're learning what it's like to live with dementia, what it's like on the family member, whether it's the spouse or the son or daughter, all the challenges, as well as all the joys that come with it. I think one of the interesting things about the path to clinical education in the US is a lot of times people will do shifts at the hospital. But, in the US, a lot of the healthcare industry is run by the health insurance industry. And as a result, the amount of time spent with patients is very short. So in the doctor's appointment, you're in and out in 10 minutes, 15 minutes. If you're working as a nurse aide at the hospital, you're in and out in 10, 15 minutes. So you're barely getting to know the people. When you go into somebody's home and care for somebody living with dementia, care for somebody living with terminal cancer, you're there for hours and hours and, multiple times a week for months and years on end. you're really getting to know the person as an individual person, not just as a patient, quote unquote, and all the joys and sorrows and hopes and dreams of the person. And I think that's making people a lot more empathetic as they enter healthcare careers. So yeah, it's really an awesome unintended,
It's
benefit, I would say.
it's amazing. So
Yeah.
we've talked about the supply side of the equation, the caregivers themselves. How do you get the demand? Like, how did you get people to know that CareYaya exists and that it is different
Yes.
than existing home care solutions?
Oh, yes. Okay. Thank you for bringing that up. It was very hard. And I think that this is a funny thing about kind of the naivete of being an entrepreneur. I just thought, oh, when I started, this is amazing. Like, because I've done it myself. I found great caregivers. As soon as this product is out, everyone's going to be line out the door. It was hard. It was really hard. And I think that sometimes there's a learning in it of like direct to consumer marketplaces. And I've studied the evolution of how other innovators in the care economy in the US tried to do direct to consumer online marketplaces and quickly just pivoted B2B. And as you've seen, I'm sure with some of the other companies that have scaled over the last decade. And I think that my observation was initially, I thought direct to consumer was going to be a cakewalk because there was such an unmet need. It actually turns out, and we're still learning, it's a very geographically focused market here that there is no real national strategy. It's a ground game in each market. So in Raleigh, Durham, North Carolina, where we started, it took a while. Like one of the biggest initial barriers was, oh, students as caregivers, they're not reliable. Oh, no, no one wants to be the first no one wants to be the first person to try out a new thing. So they're like, oh, let me just wait until other people use it. It's because it's not like buying a new t-shirt or, a new like a water bottle or something, right? It's basically like, okay, this is very sensitive and delicate. So it was hard and it was a lot of like building trust. What I've realized over time is it's a lot of like building organic trust. So we do zero advertising. We don't buy ads on Google, Facebook. We don't play those games with AdWords. So we're playing kind of like a slow game, but we're like building kind of like a go direct to the people. So we do a lot of stuff on social media. We reach people a lot in the community. It's just like patience, I would say. Now that we've been at it for 3 years, there's an accumulated kind of buzz building. And ultimately, I think the biggest buzz building is just the quality. I would say that people who experienced the care were so blown away with how good it was that they started telling their friends. They started telling people in support groups. They started telling people at their church or, religious congregation. They started telling people, the doctors, the social workers. So word of mouth was and still is the best strategy. And, I feel like that's kind of counterintuitive for a lot of people who are starting kind of like care businesses. But yeah, I would say we've grown purely from product quality. All advertising and marketing, all that hasn't really worked. And, we've done experiments, but it's been a ground game. And I think that sometimes that just requires like an incredible amount of patience.
Absolutely. So product-led growth and word of mouth.
Yeah.
But if I hear you correctly, if I understand you correctly, you have to sort of break ground in each local market to make sure that you are known and that people sort of know and trust you. And then you have this little small group of people who are like the early adopters. And then that sort of starts the way.
Like there's no, for better or worse, there's no hack, as in like there's no shortcut here. And I think it's kind of interesting because like in studying the evolution of the market, I think, and this is kind of like an interesting thing I think about often with like VCs and who funds kind of age tech innovation. I think that some of the best and biggest companies are built with just patience, and it builds on the timeline of the market, not on the timeline that the entrepreneur or the investor can kind of force into the market. So I think that's kind of like an interesting observation here. Yeah, it's just like product-led growth, and it kind of grows on its own, and then it suddenly starts growing very fast on its own. But anything you try to do to push it doesn't really work. Or I would say, and this is why I very much hesitate on like any kind of paid advertising and marketing, it can sometimes backfire, And I think that one of the biggest case studies in seeing, why isn't there an Uber for caregiving in the US, or DoorDash or whatever analogy you want to call it, is because I think there have been massive amounts of impatience and whether it's led by the investors or the entrepreneurs or the combination of both, just a desire to absolutely gun it and force the market. And I think when you force the market, it backfires, and it backfires in low quality. And then that kind of becomes a vicious feedback loop.
It makes a lot of sense. So is there any advice is there anything that you know today that you wish you had known 3 years ago when you just got started? If you could take a time machine and go whisper in young Neal's ear, what would you say?
That's a good question. I'd say, yeah, some of the things that, I've learned, one of the biggest things I've learned is, um, speaking of product-led growth, is other products. Constantly focus on developing other products to solve the unmet needs of the people you're serving. And that kind of like foots into, kind of like what we're working on now is I think that both helps people solve their problems and grows the whole thing faster. And by that, I mean, it's kind of counterintuitive. Like usually many investors and advisors would suggest just put your head down and focus on what you're building and don't get distracted. I'm the king of distractions, kind of like ADHD person. So actually, and so in the last like year, we're just kind of like, all right, if it's product-led growth and people are liking the product, why don't we just develop other products and solve people's problems? So one of the things we did, I actually recently wrote a book about it and launched a big innovation about it. But here, I'll show you. Okay, the book's called Insured to Death: How Health Insurance Screws Over Americans and How We Take It Back. It's actually become a bestseller on Amazon in health policy. And, one of the biggest problems we observed is a lot of older adults and their family caregivers are dealing with health insurance battles. And it's kind of a uniquely American problem, but a lot of the insurance for people above 65 has been privatized in the last decade. Medicare as the government insurer used to be the payer for everybody above 65. And, it was a nice program. And, they typically, if you need something, they'll give it to you. Like the denial rates are very low. Over the last decade or so, it's been privatized with what's called Medicare Advantage, these for-profit plans. And now over half of older Americans above 65 are on these plans. Unfortunately, when you cut through all the marketing, I think the program is really Medicare disadvantage. People get on it when they're a healthy 67-year-old person thinking, hey, there's fringe benefits and perks like, oh, they're going to pay for my gym membership and things like that. But really, the way cost control works and the way the insurers make profit is by denying care when something bad happens. And when then you're 75 and you become ill with cancer, you have a hospitalization, you break something, suddenly they start denying a lot of things. And then you're like, wait, why am I on this? It's not an advantage. So, we found a lot of families caring for older adults are fighting denied insurance claims, and that's consuming a lot of time and stress. So we decided to do something about it. So we launched an AI product to help people programmatically appeal and streamline the whole process. An unsolved problem we found is 99% of people who have denied claims don't appeal. And believe it or not, 1 in 5 older Americans has had a claim denied within the last year. So it's a real issue. It's a real issue from a healthcare perspective, healthcare access, and also financial toxicity perspective, that either you had a stroke and they're not going to pay for your physical therapy to recover. So you're either going to pay out of pocket and end up spending thousands of dollars, or you're not going to get it, or you're going to delay it for a month or two fighting it out, in which case literally your condition's going to get worse and your odds of recovery are going to be lower. So, we basically realized in this battle, regular people don't have a chance. Family caregivers are very stressed. Unless somebody's a doctor or unless their brother or sister is a doctor, how are they going to write this appeal? So, we built an AI system trained off thousands and thousands of appeal to help people fight back. And it was just kind of like a, internal tool that people were using. And then it just blew up. It just absolutely blew up, and it's gone absolutely viral around the country. It's actually become a hot product that people are using on its own beyond just caring for an older adult. A lot of family caregivers are using it for themselves. They're using it for other family members. Like the claim denial epidemic has now affecting 60 million Americans, which is kind of crazy how big the unsolved need is. So that was kind of a cool lesson of like classical startup theory as laid out by investors or VCs might be, you don't do that. You focus on your, kind of caregiver matching thing. But the reality of market is you see a big problem people are having and you just obsessively create products to solve that problem, and actually creates a growth flywheel where that is resulting in our core product growing faster and a lot of people knowing about it. That product itself is growing faster. And overall, just more and more people are thankful that you're solving real problems that they're having. So I think that's like one advice that, shifted my internal mindset about a year ago. And, initially against a lot of pushback and, thought it might be a distraction. It's actually turned out to be a blessing. And I think that's like informed my MO. So if I could go back 3 years and tell my old self that, embrace the distraction, not a complete distraction, but, embrace the idea of solving other problems, not just laser focused on the one product that you're doing. And I think that's like kind of counterintuitive.
Absolutely. And like you said, if the other product that you're building is a flywheel and a growth engine for your core offering and it's trust and goodwill with potential clients, then why
Yeah.
not go ahead and build it? So where can people access this AI tool?
Yeah, it's available to anyone. They can go to counterforcehealth.org. We have its own name. So COUNTERFORCE health.org. Or, they can hit us up on LinkedIn or anything and we're happy to show them. But it's actually been a real blessing where, so first, family caregivers of older adults are using it, through hospitalization, stroke recovery, things like that, medication denials. Then a lot of people started using it for themselves. Then patient advocacy groups started using it. And then the coolest thing in the last couple of months is tons of clinics around the country are using it. That's amazing. Like, it's clinics are drowning in these claim denials too. And for many of the doctors, nurses, administrative staff, social workers, it's a real ordeal because they don't have hours and hours to fight back. So they're like, oh, there's an AI that does this for me in 2 minutes and it's high accuracy and it's has a higher win rate, than people are able to achieve on their own. That's like a win for all. So that's been pretty cool. So yeah, anyone's open to accessing it on the site, and we welcome any users and we want to help more and more people.
That
And
is,
now we're like getting inbounds from hospitals, which is kind of like even more surprising. So
wow,
yeah.
that is awesome. Well, speaking of
Yeah.
AI, can we talk a little bit about the technology that you use internally at CareYaya? I assume you have
Yeah.
your own AI in the back end to help with, I don't know, handling a 45,000 people workforce?
Yeah. There's quite a bit of AI in the back end, and I would say it's like, it's kind of not the, glamorous AI that a lot of people kind of like would talk about, which I think actually the insurance appeal AI is quite glamorous, where it's doing a lot of work for you and generating things. This AI is like just much more practical of like intelligent automation and intelligent machine learning and kind of like data science, pattern recognition. So, we are running interviews on so many caregivers. We have ridiculous data on time percentages, ratings of like how the family rates the caregiver rates the family. Were they late? Did they do all the tasks they were supposed to do? Et cetera. And then just kind of like, even experience of like in between shifts, how the communication was, between the caregiver and the family. So you can analyze a lot of that data and now start predicting based on, okay, like right now, it's the start of the fall semester at campuses across America. So we're anticipating probably in the next month, we'll have maybe 8 to 10,000 new applications, right? How are we going to process that? Our team is not very large. So we can process that first pass very intelligently and programmatically through AI of watching a lot of the video interviews, looking for patterns, seeing how those patterns correlate to prior caregivers and how they ended up doing, and then using that to predict, hey, this is the top 20% batch, next 20% batch, et cetera. And then on top of that, overlaying kind of like human in the loop. So there's been a lot of AI in terms of like vetting and educated guessing how someone's likely to do on the care side. Similarly, on the family side, there's also been a lot of like intelligent like use case of AI, really just kind of like data science and machine learning of saying, how is the care likely to go? Is it going to be in line with expectations? We really, I'd say, unlike a lot of other care providers, we focus a lot on the care experience for the students. We really want to make sure that the care is aligned with what they like doing, that the people receiving the care are treating them very well. It's actually, interestingly, a lot of the care companies will just overly focus on whatever the client wants and then just throw the caregivers into difficult situations. We don't do that. Like, we will deactivate clients as rapidly as we deactivate caregivers. So interestingly, by keeping it very, very high bar on how the care experience is for the caregiver, the platform becomes filled with better caregivers, So I think that's something that's counterintuitive that I've learned. But a lot of this can be done or at least accelerated in the early days through AI. And then, you have somebody in the loop.
Absolutely. So how does training work for new caregivers? Because it is a very demanding job, both physically and emotionally.
Yes. Yeah. So that was actually part of the reason I was at Johns Hopkins is in our early days, we won a really big training grant. Speaking of AI, like I forgot to mention that we ended up building an AI program to personalize and customize caregiver training for, thousands of healthcare students. And, the idea was basically, how do you meet people where they're at? This is Gen Z, right? So, they're not necessarily, especially when they're doing gig economy stuff, going to have the patience to sit there and do 100 hours of training in advance. So we were able to build an AI system, effectively an app, to quickly figure out what have you done in the past, who are you going to care for next, and what are the next 3 bite-sized 2 to 5 minute training videos that we can give you to upskill you and increase your confidence level. And then after each session, we kind of keep upskilling you. So it's kind of like almost like, in our grant, we wrote the Duolingo. Are you familiar with that product, Duolingo, the language learning? So we kind of like, we were like, well, let's build a Duolingo of caregiver training, of like bite-sized training modules to gradually upskill and increase confidence. It's actually been working reasonably well. So that's been pretty cool. So that's one way we manage, the training and upskilling of, a large workforce. And then the second way we manage is we actually focus very much just on lower acuity. So we don't allow bookings of people with like slightly higher acuity. And I feel like one day we may enter into that market, but we did a lot of research with AARP and we're part of the AgeTech Collaborative. And in that program, we realized that 61% of the cumulative man hours of care is companion level care only, not the higher acuity tasks. So we're like very, very laser focused on that market. So the student's expectation and the family's expectation, and we really screen on that, is no medical things will be done, during the care session.
That is a very important, I guess, expectation to set with families, because I assume that many of them who come onto your website and see that you are hiring medical students or nursing students assume that you're going to do the medical stuff.
Yes. And that's one where we're very clear in the FAQ, but nonetheless, you're right. Like people have, it's really a sad thing. I'd like to solve that problem. I don't think it's like in the product roadmap currently, but one day I'd like to solve the problem in the next, 2 to 3 years, because we're pretty transparent in the FAQ, that these are students, they're not going to be doing clinical stuff. Yet people try and people book, and then they're very disappointed when we turn them away. And I think the unmet need there is massive. People are facing very high costs and very much difficulty in finding people. And what people are experiencing there is, despite the quote unquote training of someone, like let's say in the traditional care industry, somebody might help with bathing or somebody might help with insulin injections or things like that. They are trained on those tasks, but the relational aspect of care is really missing. So the families are like, I don't really like that. And the cost is ridiculous. So a lot of people can't afford it. And a lot of the family members end up doing it themselves. And these family members aren't trained. If you're like a 75-year-old spouse of someone with dementia and you have to give them insulin injections, or you have to, bathe them, or you have to do other things, unless you were a nurse, this is the first time in your life that you're learning how to do that, So I think it's kind of like, it's an interesting contradiction in the care market. I mean, even when I was managing my wife's cancer care, there were several things I had to manually do, including administration of medications, injections, a lot of like quasi-medical procedures at home. And I had no prior training in that stuff. So it's interesting how the care industry is like regulated and operates in the US, that 63 million Americans are effectively doing nursing level work for their spouse or adult parent, but yet you cannot formally connect them with another caregiver who do the same thing without going through a ridiculous amount of, formalized training. And I think that's kind of a gap. Like I have a lot of theories on, so many people are complaining about caregiver shortages. Well, I think it's like structural. It's structural because of the industry. The industry and the industry overregulation, is almost like a kind of like regulatory barrier to entry, is causing the caregiver shortage.
Absolutely. So, well, speaking of the regulatory barrier, now that CareYaya is available nationally, does this mean that you had to get a license in all 50 states?
We operate as a care registry. So it's not a care agency, it's kind of just a connecting platform, and it operates very similar to, I don't know if you're familiar with care.com. It's kind of like the biggest, like the OG in the care industry. It's also an online care registry. So that's the way care.com operates. And, as a result of that, there's some pros and cons, but it's like, there's a limitation to how much directly, we can be involved. And we are not an employer. It's like an online marketplace, which I think has its pros and cons. We're always talking with like state regulators. Like we're very close with like in our home area in North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services. And in the early days of starting it was very much transparent of like building a relationship with the government, being very transparent of, hey, here's what we're building, want your support, blessing. And ultimately they loved it to the point where I'm the only private sector care company in our state that serves on the steering committee on aging. So it's kind of like pretty cool at Health and Human Services. We've had a lot of dialogue with Health and Human Services now at the federal level. So I think they're very aware and interested and supportive of what we're doing. A couple of weeks ago, I was just at a big conference where there were a lot of leaders from Health and Human Services, and they proactively invited CareYaya, and I was like, oh, this is very interesting that they're interested in our work. So I think that government and at the top level, as well as at many of the states level, are realizing there's a problem, and I think a lot of their constituents are pushing back. So I expect a wave of like deregulation to happen here. So yeah, that's my cautiously optimistic tone. Because the problem, if you think about it, is okay, the care industry wants to keep regulatory barriers, right? So they can kind of keep their market position. But the people on the ground are the voters. And whether it's the older adults, their spouses, or the adult children, and a lot of the voters are getting pretty frustrated when it comes time to caring for someone, that there's minimal support. There's an extremely expensive market that has a pretty low quality care. And people are just like, what am I supposed to do? And unfortunately, in the US, the government doesn't really help you. So you're out of pocket paying. So it's, Medicare covers a lot of stuff. Medicare covers $35,000 dementia drug that has, less than 20% efficacy, but it covers $0 if you need a caregiver to help out with mom and dad. So I think as a result of the financing of the care market in the US of just like heavily out of pocket, I think people are like really putting pressure on their state and federal government of like, we need better solutions. So I think it's going to be one of the biggest issues over the next 5 years with our aging population.
Absolutely. I think and when we see that the caregiver population and the older population is growing, that it impacts more and more Americans. And yeah, you're right. This should be a topic on which elections are like decided, right?
Yeah. I think on that note, I think in the next 5 years or less even, I would be surprised if even in the 2028 election, it becomes a big issue. And here's my kind of hypothesis why. The probability of getting dementia goes to about 30% if you live to 80. So it's like if you're fortunate enough to live that long, there's a chance that you'll get, some cognitive decline. The baby boom in America, well, I guess around the world, the baby boom really started after World War II. So 1945, 1946, 80 years plus is 2025, right? So we are just hitting the wave of the initial baby boomers hitting 80. And in the next 5 years, a ton of them are going to hit 80. The dementia rates are skyrocketing. In our state, the number of people living with dementia is expected to double in the next 4 years. So it's like eye-opening. And the care industry is going the other way. There's been a reduction in the number of caregivers available. There's been a reduction in the number of people working in senior living, assisted living facilities. The cost of care is skyrocketing. So I actually think it's going to become, I was surprised it wasn't a big hot button political issue in 2024, but I feel like it was like on the early cusp of that. But by 2028, it's going to be really obvious. And I think now, societally, I think one of the most encouraging developments is look in the last like 6 months to 1 year. Bruce Willis, the very famous actor, his wife has now come public about caregiving and all the challenges and ups and downs. Bradley Cooper, another famous actor, put out an entire documentary on caregiving. We collaborated a lot with PBS on like doing a bunch of screenings for that. And then recently Taylor Swift came out talking about caregiving for her own father. So I think it's like hitting that social consciousness where a lot of middle-aged people are going to go through this suddenly. The celebrities are kind of like, if you think about Taylor Swift, I mean, she's a brilliant business person beyond just being like a talented singer. And I think she's great at spotting trends. So, it's kind of interesting, the trend. And I think as a result, there's going to be a lot of, just the number of people going through this. It's one of the most undercovered issues, I think, in American media of how many people go through caregiving compared to how much it's discussed openly in pop culture media. And I think that's about to change very quickly.
Absolutely. So my last question to you today is the vision that you have for CareYaya. If you take out your crystal ball, in the best case scenario, where is CareYaya in 5 or 10 years?
Yeah, ultimately the vision for CareYaya is, I would say, building an Amazon, building kind of like an amazing, and I know some people have a controversial take, so let's say Costco, but whatever you want to call it is kind of like a price and quality leader that scales and makes a huge impact in the market and creates kind of like, the benefits of some of these amazing innovations are almost like they're playing for economies of scale. And I think that in the care industry, I've yet to see that many care operators playing for economies of scale. It's like a huge market that is very siloed and a cottage industry, hyper-focused on individual geographies and hyper-focused on scaling kind of high gross margin business models. And I think that there has not been a genuine attempt to scale extremely low. And I know this kind of goes counterintuitive to a lot of investors. I don't really care. This is my theory, is that literally the margin is the opportunity. Just undercut ridiculously on margin. You have to be very focused on managing your cost. But if you scale an extremely low markup or low margin business in a $500 billion care economy, you can build a very scale player that is delivering very high quality at the most affordable prices possible. And I think that's really the gap. That I actually think that a lot of people have gotten the business model of caregiving wrong. Most of the care companies are capturing more than half the value, and the caregiver is capturing less than half, and the caregiver is doing 99% of the work. So I think if you actually build a care company where the value captured reflects the value delivered, which is razor thin, and you go for maximum scale and you keep a very high focus on quality, I think you can build, a huge, like, why isn't there a $5 billion care company? Why isn't there a 10 billion? Why isn't there a $100 billion care company? And of course, it's not just going to provide caregiver matching. I think there's an opportunity to enter the market through caregiving, and then kind of like we did with this insurance product, rapidly iterate and build other products, whether it's helping people, age safely at home, whether it's monitoring. I mean, a lot of stuff that in the age tech ecosystem, there's individual point solutions doing, but there is an integration of that. Believe it or not, one of the biggest inbound calls CareYaya gets, like we get called in from a lot of age tech companies, is, oh, can you push their product through our marketplace? And I'm like, okay, great. Not really that interested. We're in early stages. But if you kind of ultimately think about it, why not, right? Like, why not? If you are running care delivery in thousands and tens of thousands and eventually hundreds of thousands of homes around the country, why not use that as a touch point to either in-house do a lot of innovations or bring third-party innovations in, and then kind of almost recreate what might be a tech-enabled, instead of going into senior living, recreate that experience at home. So I think the long-term goal would be, I think technology is advancing very fast. I think labor force solutions are needed. And I think if you can pull it off right, you don't have to have them move into a assisted living facility or, kind of nursing home. You can keep people healthier and happier and aging at home longer, and do it in a very affordable way that reduces the burden on the family caregiver. I think if you pull that off well, you can build a $100 billion company.
Absolutely. And that is a wonderful vision.
Yeah, we are already picked out the IPO ticker on the NASDAQ, YAYA. I think that's a cool path to IPO this thing. And I think that, previously I was a hedge fund manager, and I think obviously I'm like very mission focused and I would consider myself a social entrepreneur now. But I really observed from even the financial markets, there was a huge hunger and a desire to kind of buy a tech-enabled caregiving or aging-focused solution. I think a lot of people in the public markets recognize the trend of aging of America. I think people are looking for solutions, and I just think that something hasn't been built yet, that is of that scale. But I think ultimately, the goal and the vision for CareYaya, let's see over the if within 5 years we're not public, I will have failed, at the mission. So I hope, and of course, like even post-public, I would like to keep running it. I have a lot of ideas on product roadmap, but yeah, I think that's kind of the opportunity.
That is a fantastic analysis of the market. And yeah, I can't wait to have this interview in 5 years when CareYaya is public and see how it all came about.
Yes.
Yeah. So that was actually my last question. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you'd like to add? Any call to action to entrepreneurs in the audience, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I think call to action. I love when other entrepreneurs enter the industry. I think that this industry there's so much opportunity. I think that, I have had the unfortunately difficult experience of going through caregiving myself. I wouldn't wish that on people unless they've been through it. It's very difficult. But I was unaware of kind of the need and the opportunity. And, I hope that more people enter, because I think beyond just kind of like the business opportunity and all that, I think there's a big social opportunity that, how many more apps do we need to do AI-powered sales agents or social media apps or automation of this and that? I think, it's good that people are innovating in this stuff, but the amount of brain power going into some of these industries compared to kind of what is the impact on society and compared to how much competition there is and kind of just a waste of time, to me is kind of absurd. Same with funding. The amount of funding going into some industries to me just doesn't make sense, where it's like, what's the point? And I think meanwhile here, it's kind of a circular where more funding should be going to this because it's a big unsolved problem and a big unmet need. But I think it's kind of circular because enough really aggressive and talented and motivated people are not going into entrepreneurial opportunities here. As a result, the funders are like, yeah, why should I fund? So I think you need kind of like more talented people going into this field, solving problems. That creates a flywheel that attracts investors and capital, and then you really build an awesome ecosystem, which I think there's early inklings of that happening over the last couple of years. But, I think that, yeah, the advice would be jump in. I think it's awesome. I think, putting my investor hat on, it's easier to enter markets where there's large need and less competition. And if I was a tech-focused entrepreneur right now, like, why would I enter some other markets? There's ridiculous amount of competition and you're fighting over scraps. I think this is an opportunity where there's so much unmet need. I mean, whatever it is, it doesn't even have to be caregiving. It could just be helping people with can you imagine like earlier diagnostics of dementia? There's a million opportunities, digitally as well as like through, science. I think therapeutics, tons of opportunity, rehabilitation post-stroke. I mean, there's just like insane amount of opportunity that if I wasn't doing this, I'd be doing another startup in this field. But the opportunity set compared to the competitive landscape, I think calls for way more people to enter. So yeah, that's what I'll leave entrepreneurs with.
Thank you for this inspiring call to action, Neal. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate you joining me on the show today. It was an absolute pleasure chatting with you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the time. And yeah, I hope this inspires people. And if anyone wants ideas, hit me up. I have like a laundry list of ideas that I would build otherwise that I'm happy to just give away to people. And I hope somebody builds them.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Neal.
Thank you.
If you found this conversation insightful, you will love the episode with Himanshu Jain, the founder of CareYaya. I'll put the link right here. Until next time, stay humble, stay curious.